All right. So, folks, our guest today is Jonas Lau Markussen, an expert in and recreator of Viking art. Jonas, will you tell us a little bit about yourself to start us off?
Yes. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of research on Viking art and trying to recreate it and to put the knowledge about it out there to you guys through my newsletter and on Patreon. And I've also started creating some videos on YouTube to try to explain how I recreated myself based on the historical styles. So my background is in first and foremost in illustration and graphic design, and I'm a graduate of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts Architecture in Copenhagen. So you can say my background is in graphic design, which I work in professionally, and I have an education in architecture. And after I finished that, I started working more in depth with the Viking art styles and trying to get deep into that, and also try to make that some kind of a living. I hope to do that sometime soon, and gradually shifting over from my freelance work. That was the very brief introduction. And please, if you have questions, let me know.
Well,
and I'll take it from there.
If I could start off with one,
Yeah.
there's so many different styles of Viking art, right? I mean, you look at the chart in something like James Graham Campbell's book, Viking Art, which so many people use as a reference.
This one.
Yeah, that's kind of the reference most would start with. You see all these different styles described, Norman, etc. Yeah, and then that's copied in every other book about this.
Yeah, exactly, and in mine too, more or less.
Yeah. Do you favor one particular period in that, or do you kind of go back and forth? What do you what's your relationship with the different periods of Viking art?
I think I have the affinity with the Broa style, or the style 3E, I think it's called, which is on the verge of the Viking Age, but the first style of the Viking Age. That's my, if I have to name a favorite, that's the one.
Okay, and if people are looking for historical examples of that, what would you point to as one or two particularly striking historical examples of the whole style?
There's the I'm not good with just getting the names off the top of my head, but if you want one, the Broa Mount from Gotland is a good example of that style.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with it. You probably are.
Yeah, I've seen it.
I think it's from a horse harness, if I recall it correctly. And they have various different motifs on them. Some are animal-like, and some are more humanoid figures. And we got also some of the common main motifs of the Viking Age represented. We both have the ribbon animals, which is most common, or most common in the late Viking Age, but also in the pre-Viking Age art, actually. And then we have the gripping beast represented in this find too, which is this weird bear-like or cat-like animal curled up in a knot.
Right.
We see it in Broa style, and in the Oseberg style, and in Borre style. I think you probably know it if you know it from the Borre style, where you have these pendant, which is shaped of this animal curled up in in a knot.
So and many beautiful examples in the Oseberg find.
Yes, very much. And that's, yeah, it's a peculiar time period regarding the art, because we don't have a very good representation of or shall I say, at least to my knowledge, it's hard to kind of draw the line between the style periods from the Broa style to the Borre style. So we have the Oseberg find in between these two styles, which is mostly in wood carvings, and that's a little atypical for the finds we typically do in Viking-Age art, because most of what we have is metalwork. So a lot of jewelry and horse harness pieces and swords and stuff like that.
Right, things that preserve better.
Sorry?
Things that preserve better over time.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Oseberg find is a little peculiar in that we don't have, at least to my knowledge, it's hard to translate the wood carving style into the style of the metal work. It's hard to kind of establish the link between the two.
I see what
in
you mean.
Some ways.
Because the mediums are so different, they demand different techniques and some different styles. Is that what you mean?
Yes, and what we have of the finds from that period in particular is pointing in different directions, so to speak. So in the later styles, the Ringerige style, an example, and the Une style, we have representation in wood carvings, and we have art on the rune stones, and a lot of jewelry, and a vast amount of all of them, more or less. Not so much woodwork, but jewelry, metalwork, and rune stones is very well documented. So it's very easy to kind of make the link between the different mediums and see how it translates, from how the style translates from one medium to another.
Sure, just because, I mean, you'll be working with different tools. The material will be a different resistance to the tool. I mean, I can definitely see how that would affect it. Have you yourself experimented with making jewelry?
No, not really. Not the Viking art, at least.
Well, Martha up here was pointing out, to the untrained eye, the Viking art style looks similar to that in Irish illuminated manuscripts of the same period. Is that something you could comment on? The intersection between those styles?
Yes, to some regard. I'm not too familiar with the manuscripts and all of the representation there, but I know that the styles kind of rubbed on of each other. And actually, if you want to know more about it, this is a really good material to get to know more, because he goes into how the Nordic styles how they inspire the Irish, or the how do you say it, the areas outside of Scandinavia, where the Vikings settled, and of course there was an influence on the art on the British Isles, and there was an influence from the British Isles, the art of the British Isles, onto the Scandinavian areas too. I think you can argue that some of the stonework was influenced from the stonework on the British Isles and brought back to Scandinavia, because we don't see the level of craftsmanship in Scandinavia before we actually have these very well-founded settlements in the British Isles. But to come back to the manuscripts, I know that the Untitled had a lifespan of its own in Ireland, both in jewelry and other artifacts, long after it actually diminished in fashion in the Scandinavian world. So you have, at least in that sense, you have a very direct influence on the local art in a British area, and that is reflected in the manuscripts. So there is inspiration going back and forth and influence on each other. So I think, and taking into consideration that there had been a long cultural influence and connection between these areas also before the Viking Age,
right?
That you kind of have a very good background for these sorts of influences being picked up in manuscript art and the like. Yeah.
Well, and
I don't know if. Sorry.
I mean, you also wonder how much of what's shared we will never see, just because it's things that you would never find preserved, right? I mean, we're all kind of judging from such an incomplete record. I'm sure the interactions and the mutual influences would be more interesting if we could actually see all that was produced in a given year.
Yeah.
Right? Seeing probably 0.01% of everything is produced in a given year.
Yeah. And that's the sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's the absolute core of it. The issue with Nordic art, that it's really hard to actually make a coherent but also a definitive statement about what was Nordic or Norse art actually, because we don't know other than what is left for us, and that is only a tiny fraction of what was actually produced, and especially regarding the wood carvings and the textiles and all these kind of things that we just have no or very, very little left of. So that's
right. With the Oseberg find being a really big exception, including even textiles, which is something we were mentioning with Johanna Katrin Friedrichsöder when she was on a few. Vicky asks, Ibn Fadlan describes the Rus as being tattooed from neck to toe. Given the early interaction between early Slavic people and the Varangians, is it possible to speculate about what those tattoo designs might have looked like? If you
you can speculate. And the short answer is we have no idea, and probably they were not, at least in the Nordic areas, they probably wasn't tattooed, as far as I know.
Yeah,
but you can always speculate, and maybe some were, maybe some weren't. But I think actually, I don't know if they are a good example, but if you want to speculate, I'm actually impressed with the tattoos of the Viking show, the way they kind of made some patterns that felt very human made, if you know what I mean. They feel very handcrafted, at least in a when you first see them. I haven't looked into them, and I don't know how they hold up on close inspection, but at least the when I think of Ragnar's head tattoos, the way the patterns are weaving or kind of flowing around his head and neck feels very organic in a way that I rarely see in other kinds of recreations, if you want to call it that, because the Viking show is very much not a historical representation of what was actually created in the Viking Age regarding art or artworks.
Right. Well, and like Seth says, it's like something adapted from a style that would work well in the body instead of just copying and pasting something.
Yes.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I can appreciate that.
And I think if you want to elaborate a little bit more about on it, I think a familiar find is the Marmin axe.
Beautiful.
If some of you can recall the bird on the one side and the kind of tree or vegetal pattern on the other side, they have the same handmade, very organic feel to it. The way the patterns kind of just grow on their own, and I think that's at least what I've seen. It's the same way that the patterns on Ragnar's head is kind of flowing and feel very handmade in that sense.
Yeah, that Mammon axe with the silver inlay is probably my number one favorite object of Viking art. Christian asked something related to that I think we've already sort of addressed, which is whether tattoos are part of Nordic art. People really are interested in this. People love tattoos right now. But there's just not that much evidence I've ever seen beyond Ibn Fadlan saying that he encountered someone.
No, and I think it's worth to note, sorry for interrupting that, but that what Ibn Fadlan is describing is not necessarily indigenous Norse people, but from another area. So it's you can't really take much from that in reality.
What I thought about that is you don't know with the Rus if they're mixed with certain amounts of Slavic customs, right, or whatever other customs they encounter in Eastern Europe, and to what extent there's like this sort of, you're maybe looking at a particular subculture that developed and that uses tattoos, much like 50 years ago when not many people had tattoos. If you met somebody with a tattoo, it was probably a Navy guy or a biker, right? There could be subcultures within the larger culture that use tattoos more. But we just don't have that much evidence, and no Old Norse word for tattoo that we know.
Yeah, that's the other thing, and I think you might know more about that than I do. But to my knowledge, the word tattoo or any descriptions in the sagas or anything similar to that, it's not there.
No.
So,
Nero,
unfortunately.
Yeah. Nero asks, what are some of the more common materials for certain motifs or epics? If I understand the question right, so are the materials they're using in art changing as time goes on?
Yes, they are. I haven't studied that very deeply, but I know that I think because it's also very much an economical question, if you like, because the availability of material is very much dependent of the trade connections, what was going on around Scandinavia, so to speak, and so we see a lot of as we see today, similarly to that, that changes in society very much reflect what materials are available to us and how or what medium gets picked up in art, and that is reflected in Viking-Age art as well.
Right.
I don't know if of course the runestones is a good example of that, because of course we see runestones early on, but we don't see them decorated to the degree that we see in the last couple of centuries of the Viking Age. So that's a good example of a medium that gets picked up that wasn't really that present in the earlier years, with some exceptions.
Yeah, you really see the runestone art explode after about 1000 or so, it seems.
Yeah, and actually after the Norse world gets Christianized.
Right.
So that's another important point. So what you actually see reflected in the or on the runestones is not really a pagan worldview per se, but a Christian worldview influenced by pagan or Nordic influences. So that's worth bearing in mind when you're looking at the art from these stones.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's still some, see if you agree or disagree with the statement that it's still stylistically pretty North. You don't see anything that's
absolutely
outside of the Scandinavian world. So there's a culturally internal incentive to make these things, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
And then
I agree.
And to me, that also raises an interesting question of public art versus private art, because although this could be a preservation problem, it's interesting that we see more of that really public art as time goes on. Whereas it seems like our earlier examples of art seem to be more private, right? Like jewelry or smaller things like that. Do you think that as time goes on, they're making larger, more public art? Is that part of a cultural or artistic development, or is that just an accident of preservation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about it. But I think, yeah, coming back to the runestones is a very good example again, because that's a medium to large scale and very public object to create. But again, I think maybe also the material, the medium plays a role in this too, because we don't, again, have a lot of the woodwork surviving to today from some of the previous ages, maybe.
Right.
So that could be reflected in that. But again, we have the Gotland picture stones, which is an example of something very public, or a public expression, very much like the runestones.
Oh, that's true. What about that?
Sorry?
Yeah, that's true. And I hadn't been thinking about that. And that's very early on. You're right. Some of those I think date from 700, 800.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's peculiar why they. Yeah, of course it's a very regional fashion, but it's also peculiar why we don't see similar works throughout Scandinavia in some similar fashion.
That's
in
true.
stone or other mediums. But
That's
again,
true.
wood.
That is an interesting point about how geographically limited those are.
Yeah, and yeah, sorry.
No, I think we have a little bit of a lag. A similar kind of question, or something kind of dovetails into that. Christopher asks, have you stumbled upon any Norse art that breaks away from the norm with a weird design or pattern? For example, the Rookstone, which is one of the very few, if not the most detailed runestones. So examples of art that are kind of divergent.
Yes. Overall, I think it's fair to say that the style was very uniform in certain ways. So you actually don't have a lot of that present, but of course, what comes to mind is some of the maybe less talented artists or less trained artists. And you see that especially on some of the runestones, where you get some weird shapes and weird representations of these animal shapes or animal figures that you know should look a certain way, but they get messed up, so they get weird noses, or the anatomy is just off.
That's funny.
That's really
well
an experience.
You see that in runic writing too, where there's inscriptions that it looks like were copied by somebody who wasn't actually literate, and so it doesn't understand the letter shapes, right? And like, there's a lot of them are misspelled. Something. That's funny. Yeah. So there's hacks then, just like now.
Yeah.
Well, Peter asks, you don't use color in your art, but in reality, much of this art would have been highly colored. Is your use of black and white down to your graphics background, or do you think it helps or hinders your understanding of Viking art?
It's a matter of several factors. For one, it's just easier to narrow it down to just focus on the shapes, and that way it's just easier to produce a lot more illustrations while still focusing on what I've been focusing on, the shapes. But another factor is that we don't know, again, a lot about how these patterns and our artwork, how they were colored simply. We get an idea from the textiles in the Oseberg ship and some of the runestones, and that's only like a handful of runestones, still have traces of color on them. And then we have a few pieces of wood carvings from the Jelling mounts, the Jelling grave, and from a church in Hørning. And I think that's about it. And the wooden pieces are very late in the Viking Age. And the Oseberg ship it's very hard to be certain about what colors were used in the textiles. And again, this is textiles, and the patterns have a different expression in the textiles than they do in metalwork and in wood carving. So it's very hard to work with as a contemporary artist and try to replicate these the color schemes of the time period. So with that in mind, I've just tried to focus more on the patterns and try to present them that. And I hope to at some point get back to some of the more coloring themes, because that's of course very important too.
Well, and what you say there makes a lot of sense to me, and it makes me think about, for example, outsiders looking at the Vikings, the Irish, for example, when they depict Viking raiders pictorially in a manuscript, and when they talk about them, they often show them wearing blue or describe them as wearing blue. So you can get some outsider accounts, but then it occurs to me that if you were trying to reconstruct American art 1,000 years from now, when all of our textiles have disappeared, and you were relying on outsiders' perceptions of our clothing, you might think that we were all wearing military fatigues, because an outsider, say you're getting accounts from Iraq of what American soldiers wear. If you think that's what Americans are wearing back home, you're actually extremely wrong. But so sometimes even if we do have some kind of outsider account that's fairly objective, that may be so specific to one subculture that it's actually not that useful.
Yeah.
And by the way, that also probably ties back into the tattoo thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that, I don't know, I guess much of the written material is also much later.
Oh yeah.
At least written down, so you have that factor to take in mind too.
Well, sure.
So,
Well, like Renaissance artists.
and I've seen some of your videos too about how the language to describe colors is actually a whole different topic in itself, because you can't be certain how they perceived color or how they represented or spoke about color then, and the difference in how we perceive and describe color now.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's two completely separate worlds in some ways.
Right, and then the main problem with the sagas is just like Renaissance artists show Jesus wearing Renaissance clothes.
Yeah.
Saga artists might describe, rich people of the Viking Age wearing clothes that are really the clothes of rich people of 200, 300 years later, and clothes can change pretty fast.
Yeah.
So yeah, all that stuff is a little shaky. Gareth says, does the art differ a lot, say, in the Vendel Age, 500 to 700, to early Viking Age art?
From 500 to 700 to early Viking Age art. That was the question.
Yeah, right. Is there a big change from before the Viking Age to the Viking Age, or is there a lot of artistic continuity? I guess is more.
Well, yes and no, both actually. I think that's some of the fascinating aspects of the both the pre-Viking Age art and the Viking Age art, that you see some of the same core concepts through the entire time period from the the early migration period to the end of the Viking Age. So a lot of the core concepts was carried through the ages, but they had sometimes very different expressions.
For instance, something with a lot of continuity seems to be something like the gripping beast, not necessarily the full gripping beast, but the kind of twisty animal designs, those zoomorphic, not like animals.
Yeah, if you want to boil it down to the core concepts, then there's the one that carried through the whole entire period was some concept of a ribbon animal, and that type of motive we see from the early migration period, and it's also reflected in the Sutton Hoo burial find there, and that carries through all of the pre-Viking Age style periods, and then we at the verge of the migration, or the pre-Viking Age to the Viking Age in the Broa style, we see the introduction of the gripping beast. But at first they are both present, and it's first maybe in the Broa style that the gripping beast takes the center spot, or the spotlight from in the style. And then shortly after, or at the end of the Broa style, the gripping beast gets totally disregarded, and we only see more or less some expression of the ribbon animal. So that's the main overarching development of the style. And then again, you can go into the different styles and see. It's curious that, in my opinion at least, that some of the later Viking Age art styles is actually in some ways very similar to some of the first Germanic migration period artwork styles. They have very slender bodies and very if you think of the Urne style, with a very geometric expression and very slender, almost circular flow and shapes, and a very formalistic expression. And then compare that to some of the first or earliest migration period artworks. Then you have this very, very slender ribbon animal with very typological or conform shapes, like the head is shaped in a very certain way always, and the legs are in a very certain way always throughout, and the way the patterns work is very similar overall, and that's in that way you can actually compare the early migration art or period art to the late Viking Age art. And I think I don't know if they actually looked back, but in my experience, or I can't help to think if they in the late Viking Age tried to kind of get back to some of the roots in their Nordic or Norse expression of their identity, like some of the sagas and myths carried through to the more Christian influenced period. Maybe that was reflected in the artwork too.
That's a compelling thought. So just like we can consciously look back and emulate an earlier style now, they might be doing the same thing post Viking Age. That's interesting, and that's a different kind of continuity than I think I would have anticipated. That's very interesting. That kind of conscious reflection is a possibility.
Huh. Yeah, and I think it actually makes sense, because you had this very the Norse world was in some ways in opposition to the rest of Europe, and I think maybe it's speculation, but I think it could make sense in the way that you were kind of trying to establish your own Nordic identity in opposition to some of the large European empires and influences, or British on the British Isles. So it makes sense in my head. But
that's a very compelling point. And you're right. I was thinking while you were talking about that, about examples of migration age art. There's that famous chair or throne that I think is Gothic, that has some similar style, and of course those brooches that you find in migration age art do have a fair amount of similarity to some of those Viking Age styles. That's really compelling. I think that could even be deliberate nostalgic recreation. Vicky asks, because the art is so stylized, it's difficult to determine exactly what animal is being depicted. Are any of these images fantastic creatures, like some look like they might be dragons, or are they all more or less common creatures?
It's a really good question, and I would hesitate to give you a definitive answer to that, because it points in various directions, and you can say that in general there are some very basic general expression of a very very non-descriptive animal type. It's just an animal, and throughout the ages, the migration period and the Viking Age, you kind of see a kind of basic animal expression displayed on in the artwork, which typically would be some kind of ribbon animal. But from time to time, there's also a bird motive, and in the early years, my guess is it was a raven, but in the late Viking Age, it was probably more a pigeon motive or dove, or what you would call a more Christian based motive, but the through line is there. So you have these two main motives: the bird and the quadruped, the four-legged animal.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the two through lines, and then of course you have the gripping beast also. But you, on the other hand, you also have some expressions which are which bear some traits to signify that they are a specific animal. And I can't remember off the top of my head which one of these shrines it is, but on one of the Bamba, or the other, what's it called? Nürnberg, hvad fanden hedder? There's some shrines made in the Marmon style, or the early Ringerike style, which they are probably, or they are more than likely created in a Christian context. So you have this layout with the four evangelists, Jacob and so on, and a centerpiece in the middle. And each of these areas have a specific animal displayed.
Because each evangelist has his animal mascot.
Exactly. And yeah. I've read a very interesting, I think I linked it in my book and so on, an article about how, and you can clearly see that the ox, which to us would look like a dragon motive, it's what we see as claws is actually hooves, or what cows have, and the lion has a different kind of foot, and so on. So you actually have this differentiation between certain motives, and I think in that regard it's still worth keeping in mind that we have a very, I don't know what's the word for it, but it's in a Christian context, and it has a purpose, so it's very codified, and I think that would carry through in some ways, if you can get what I'm getting at, that you often only have these differentiations if they have a purpose, so to speak.
Right. So it's a very stylized animal no matter what. But if you want to distinguish a specific animal, you may do so in a way that's so stylized that we don't recognize what animal it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right. No, I can absolutely see what you mean by that. In medieval artists, it always seemed to me, and you may disagree, but they seem to make living beings pretty two-dimensional in a way that our artists try not to, and that can often make it harder for us. I think about something like the Ramstad. I think is it Ramstad? There's a runestone it's not Ramstad. I can't remember the name right now, but there's a runestone in Sweden that's really famous that depicts Sigurd slaying Fafnir, and it's got an animal that a lot of people think is the otter.
Yeah.
But we can't. It doesn't really look like an otter exactly. Just some.
But I've actually just made a documentation or a drawing of that stone, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called now either. It's on a rock face, right? That's the one.
Yeah.
The thing. Yeah. And let me think back. There's something about the context of the placement of the otter, and I don't know if I've actually read it described that way, but I think the otter is represented by a shape-shifting being,
the dwarf,
which could be a wolf typically in Norse mythology.
Okay.
So I think that may be another version of the myth or another description of this shape-shifting being. So he might not be depicted as an otter in this case, but maybe there's a reference to his capabilities as a shapeshifter by depicting him as a wolf.
That's a good thought.
It's a guess.
Speller's got the name of it. It's the Ramsund carving.
Ramsund. Exactly.
We take some more questions. We got a couple more here.
Yeah, sure.
So Nero Strasinger asks, with all the exportation of amber from Denmark during the late Bronze Age, was there still much art made with amber during the Viking Age?
Oh, I don't know. I've seen art made in this period too. Some very, very awesome little gripping beasts in 3D actually.
Wow.
I think you could probably look them up on Google fairly easily. But that's more or less that. I think.
So much.
I think it's more pearls, very more or less basic pearls, and these small pendants, animal-shaped pendants. Yeah. But it's not something very, to my knowledge at least, it's not something I'm referencing because it's not there. So I don't think there was a lot of it. No.
That's interesting. Peter has something that I think you've touched on a little bit. The art on tapestries such as those from Oseberg, Øvre and Skog seems very different stylistically from the metalwork style. Is that due to the different material, or does it actually demonstrate another form of expression entirely?
Yeah, good question. It's really hard to say because we don't have a lot of references, so it's really hard to compare it to. Actually, in the Oseberg grave and in the find there, we have different expressions of or different styles expressed in the artwork and in the wood carvings that point in some different directions, and the tapestry is a completely other direction in itself to some regard. So it's hard to say because that's more or less the only reference point we have in the textile material that survived. So I think you could, a bit speculative, maybe trace some of these shapes back to some of the Germanic styles. There's a horse-shaped brooch from, I think, some of the pre-Viking Age styles. It's fairly known. I don't know if anything comes to mind. It's very typical for the style, but it's very much a horse shape. And that piece you could maybe compare to the horses on the Oseberg tapestry, but it's maybe a bit far-fetched.
I'll see if I can find a picture of that. Now, as you talked about it, I think I can think of what you're talking about. Let's see if I can find a picture and put it with the picture of the tapestry when I put this up publicly.
I have it in my archives if you need it.
Okay. Yeah,
so I can easily find it. I won't stick for it now, but I can find it for you.
No, I know we wouldn't find it if we dug for it right now. Rodman asked, did the different art styles tend to stay within certain geographical areas based on what scholars know from current evidence? That brings to mind the Goatline stones being restricted to Goatline. If not, can the different art styles be more or less divided between those practiced between the Old East Norse area and the Old West Norse area? So do you see differences geographically? Different art styles being restricted to different areas, or West and East?
It's not something I've dug very deep into mostly because, again, the material is so overall so fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
So at least to me, it's hard to say or rely on the info that's present now, because what you may find a vast amount of in some place, very geographically specific, might just represent that it was popular there, or that it was in some rare circumstances got buried there in some very fortunate circumstances, that it just happened to survive to our time.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that, and again, I'm not an expert in that area per se, because I haven't really studied it, mostly because I don't feel that it's, maybe, at least not to me, not to, but a relevant question in this matter, because in my eyes the Norse world was so connected that
Right.
it doesn't, in my eyes, it doesn't make sense to divide these local areas so specifically into these boxes. But of course, we see it with the Gotland stones, that they were very geographically specific. So and of course but again, it's hard to say, because or we have these workshops or artists that work very geographically specific to a market, or to a magnate, a local magnate, or a Viking town, or something like that. And so we might have these certain jewelries popping up places, and can trace them back to a local workshop. But again, is that, where did the motive for that jewelry come from? Was that a copy of another jewel, some artistic expression from a tapestry, from a wood carving, from something else that got translated into a jewelry piece? It's hard to say. And in my eyes, we see a lot of connections across the styles and in the style expressions themselves. So in my eyes, at least, it's a somewhat coherent development across the Norse world, overall speaking.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that is a little bit surprising, but also, given the paucity of our evidence, I guess I'm not too surprised that you can't really see that many geographical differences.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to say either or the other, but I think you at least have to be a little cautious about how you frame it, or to say that because something was found here, that this was a local style. You have to be very cautious about that.
Well, things can move around, for sure.
Yeah, and they did.
Yeah,
as we see.
It's a very mobile.
Yeah.
I mean, in the same way, also there's movements going on that we don't even know about. I mean, if we didn't have the written accounts of the North trading with, say, with the Caliphate, I mean, wouldn't it be surprising to find all of these coins with Arabic inscriptions in Sweden? You know, what would we think that was if we didn't know they were moving around that much?
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure there's more microscopic examples of that all over Scandinavia, where we just don't even realize the movement behind why something wound up where it wound up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Does anybody have another question you want to throw in? I can also see if I can get in somewhere. I don't even know where my video is. I wonder if that's how much more what happens.
Yeah. Well, it's been my pleasure. So, and I'm happy to answer more questions if you have. But it's been a pleasure.
Well, it's really been a pleasure because this is a topic that's so interesting to people, and that so few people have taken the time on that you have.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that is something truly valuable.